Welcome to this seminar and into this space. Today, Afrikagrupperna have invited some prominent guests to discuss decent housing as a global human right. With this conversation, we wish to highlight issues around housing, right to land, and recognize the struggle as global. Because no one should be able to steal your home away from you and your close ones. But we see how unfair distribution of resources and unequal housing structures are pushing people into deep poverty, out of the cities and even out on the streets.
We must free ourselves. It's a do or die situation. So I do not see myself stopping fighting for the right of the homeless and the landless to get decent housing.
Sibusiso Zikode is a South African activist and leader of the movement Abahlali. He has won this award for his tireless work and fight for the right to housing, land, and survival of the most vulnerable people of the schack settlements in South Africa. We are very happy that you're joining us for this conversation, and we congratulate you and the movement to your work. We are also very happy to have other prominent guests in this conversation today. We welcome Nomsa Sisani, the General Secretary of Abahlali. She has a long and impressive political campaign work experience, working for safe and dignified housing and resistance against evictions in South Africa. So we're very happy to have you in this conversation. We also want to give a very warm welcome to Rätten, movie director and journalist, and the producer of the award-winning documentary film Push, a documentary investing who the city is actually for. Why can we not afford to live in the cities any longer? And why is housing such a fundamental human right? We're also very happy to welcome Marcus Knutagård to this conversation, Associate Professor and Senior Lecturer at Lund University. Marcus has compiled many research projects and studies on homelessness in Sweden and in the Nordic countries, and show us and explore how social work around housing is actually practiced. We're very happy to have you in this conversation too, Marcus. Very welcome. From your angles and from your field of work, what situation have you seen for people? And I want to start off asking you, Sibo, what do you see on the ground?
Thank you very much, Anna. Greetings to you. Greetings to my fellow panelists, Marcus and the two colleagues, Nomsa and the other one. So thanks to Afrikagrupperna for organizing this. It's really an honor for me to be sharing this platform with such wonderful people. For us in South Africa and many countries around the world, the situation of housing is really a demanding one. We must say that many and millions of people are suffering from homelessness. They're also suffering from landlessness. And the barriers in most cases is the inability of our state, the policy makers, and those that are working close to the sector of housing to acknowledge the problem in the first place. I think it's important that we acknowledge that there's a serious problem on the situation of housing as a human right. And we don't think there's anybody that deserves not to have a place called home. For us, a place called home is so important to a point that it gives effect to our ability to think, but also to be more human. How do we become more human? How do we become welcoming humanity when we actually do not have homes? But also the right to the city is highly contested, and it pushes back those of us who are working with the most marginalized sectors of our society, most vulnerable people, such as women and children, which I think Nomsa will touch on. These vulnerable groups in society get affected the most by the failure of us as a society. I don't think we are doing enough, us as well, but also those who are empowered to be taking the responsibility of fulfilling this right that is enshrined in most of our country's constitution, but also by the international laws, the right to housing. So I think the state has a duty, state has responsibility around the world to ensure that the right to housing is guaranteed. Those countries that do not have it in their constitution, I would propose that it is high time that we constitutionalize the right to housing. So it must go into the constitution, but that's not enough. A good document such as our constitution is not enough. Civil society organizations, grassroots social movement like Abahlali has to give effect to make sure that the right to housing is realized and it becomes the right for everyone.
Thank you very much, Sibu. And speaking about that as the importance of a safe home and also who has the right to the city, I want to ask you, Frederick, what you have seen traveling around the world following the UN Special Rapporteur on adequate housing around the globe. You must have seen some interesting movement and also experienced stories from people from different locations. Do you mind sharing a bit what you have seen on the ground?
You know, the film is the ambition of the film is to try to see if there is a global pattern of the housing crisis that people are suffering all over the world, in the wealthy north and in the impoverished south. So it's like we can basically see that the same players are around everywhere. I mean, I know in Africa we talk a lot about land grabbing. It's basically the same kind of forces that are grabbing also homes, and so it's the same money. Sometimes even it's the same companies or the same hedge funds that are investing in land grabbing in, let's say, Ethiopia, then would also buy homes in Sweden. And of course, if you talk about the criminal money moving around, I mean, if you go to Cape Town, you can see big parts of the town. You know, there's luxury condos that stands empty, like parking places for money, basically. So this is not unique for South Africa. It's or for Sweden. It's like it's a global pattern. And the whole ambition with my film Push was that people also, I think, if we understand that we are up against a global beast, it's also easier for us to understand that this is a struggle we need to take together. And Leilani Farah is very clear, the amazing person I follow in Push. She's very clear to say that housing is a human right. It's actually signed by all nations on the planet because it's in the UN Human Rights Charter. And we should, I mean, by using that statement, housing is a human right, and governments have an obligation to see that people have a dignified home. I think it's a very strong thing to do for all of us, and it's kind of clear that, I mean, in South Africa, I worked a lot in South Africa from the 80s and on, and you know, I mean, you have of the classical land grabbing from way back, but then you also have the Group Areas Act, which is also kind of a land grabbing, and now you have a land grabbing of the financialization or the commodification of housing, even pushing out even more people from, let's say, Cape Town. I can also add that I, together with Leilani Farah, we have a podcast called Pushback Talks. And we had just a few weeks ago, a friend, an activist from Cape Town, Mandisa Shandu from Indifuna Ukwasi. It's a very interesting activist group in Cape Town. They actually take the city to court and force them. And they challenge things like golf courses. You know, the city owns golf courses. Why should we have people playing golf when you could instead build homes? I think that's an interesting conflict. Listen to that. We also had a podcast with activists in Nigeria. And of course, they are facing the same thing, especially with forced evictions in slum areas. Slum areas are very seldom legal grounds. So it's easier to kick people out, even if they've been living there for 50 or 60 or more years. And there are some really interesting mapping projects in Nigeria where people try to register who's living there. So it's easy to try to build some kind of legal defense of people's rights, because we know that if there is a big storm and an area goes down, the bulldozers comes in, and then suddenly you're building hotels and luxury condos or shopping malls, whatever. I mean, this is something we see not only in Africa, you see it in Latin America, you see it, everywhere. So it is a global story. That's my message.
Thank you very much, Fredrik. It's really inspiring to hear. I want to move the question to you, Nomsa, and based on what Fredrik are saying about what's happening in South Africa and globally, are you recognizing this from your work, or what do you see on the ground and like with this forced evictions and what do you see working in this field?
Hi everyone, and thank you again for inviting me here, Afrikagrupperna. Thank you so much. This is a sensitive topic, the topic of housing, because here in South Africa, it is there in the Constitution, it is said in Section 26, everybody has a right to housing. But when it's supposed to come to implementation, we don't see that. We don't implement that, but it's there. The only problem is now, when we occupy and build our own houses, we struggle, we are evicted. While it's there in the Section 26, I think housing is a human right, as much as Fredrik was saying now. It's a human right to have a housing, because when you do have a house, you have a dignity. When you have a house, you hold a hope for yourself and the hope for the children. But mostly we've seen the brutality in South Africa. When as women, we try to empower ourselves by building our own houses, we have seen so many evictions happening in South Africa. While they don't give us any houses, instead they demolish those houses we do have. So the right to housing, it goes a long way. And the housing, it goes, we cannot separate housing from the land, because housing goes together with the land issue. As much as Frederick was talking about the land grabbing, yeah, in Abahlali baseMjondolo, we talk about the land occupying, because we do occupy the land to build our own houses, because there's no way that you can have a house without the land. And the decent housing, they give you the dignity. That is why Abahlali, we struggle for land, housing, and dignity. We believe that if you do have land, you can build your own house there. But we are facing the brutal evictions here in South Africa. But we do hope that one day we'll have houses. That's our hope. And the issue of housing, it's globally, as much as Frederick is saying, it's globally the issue of land, the issue of repression against the marginalized people, it's globally. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nomsa. I want to travel back here to Sweden and ask you, Marcus, what your experiences are. We know in Sweden we have around 30,000 people living in homelessness, and there has been an increase over the last years. Do you mind telling us a bit what do you see working in this area of the right to housing?
Thank you very much, and great to see you all in all countries this wonderful day. I would say that it's sometimes the expulsion that we're talking about here from South Africa would be a bit more subtle in the Nordic countries, but it still exists. So when we talk about land grabbing and that sort of thing, we can talk about renovictions in the Swedish context, when you renovate housing, and by increasing the value, you also push people out of their rented flat because they cannot afford the higher rent. So that's sort of one phenomenon that you can see in the Nordic countries. Another problem is that an experience of being homeless is really inscribed in your soul. It becomes a long-term effect for you, but also as a researcher, hearing the stories of people experience homelessness also becomes inscribed in your soul, because they're very strong. And it's not only about pushing the idea about housing as a human right, but also looking at it as a human need. And that's why it's a human right, because everyone needs housing in order to develop and find new possibilities in their life. So what we have here is two experiences. I remember meeting one lady living outside, and as you know, Sweden can be a fairly cold country, not only in climate, but especially in climate. And living outdoors here really makes you freeze into the bones. And this lady told us that after moving into a flat, that sort of sense of coldness stayed on for a long time. Looking at one of our projects on housing first, a model where you give people experience homelessness housing first and then help out with the support they need. It took quite a long time for the first people moving in to really understand that this was their home, not like the ordinary way of working where you get a place to stay, but you have so many demands that you can easily get kicked out again. So it took a long time for these persons to feel trust towards the social services. But once that trust was established, what they said was getting your own home, getting the keys to your door, getting the power to control was the first time they felt like a human being. It's a very strong, powerful message that this is the way we should go. Thanks.
Also for touching more on the dignity connected to housing. I want to ask you, Sibu, to explore a bit more on that. What does the dignified housing and dignity means in this context to you and your movement?
I think every human being is born with such a level of dignity. Dignity is universal. So everyone has been born with such a dignity. Now, when we make a demand of a dignified home, we do mean that a home is not just about shelter. It's not about just a material that creates it, but it comes as a package. It provides some sense of security, comfort, and also it comes with basic services such as running water, sanitation, but also because a house then constitutes a family. So it's not just an individual that is expected to be a house, to be in a house, but rather a family that creates a nation, that creates a society, which is why it is important for us to really take the concept of dignity quite seriously, because we are all born with such dignity. Therefore, we are saying when we call for a decent housing that provides dignity, it must be a house that will enable us to use our intelligence to a maximum at this point for us to be productive in our contribution to a society. And therefore, dignity for us means that a house will provide security, comfort, and all enjoyment that a community, a society would have to share.
Thank you, Sibu. I want to move the conversation a bit to the political challenges that we can see all over the world. What is needed to achieve the goal of equal access to safe housing, and what do you recommend the demands would be on our politicians? And I want to ask you, Marcus, first from a Swedish perspective, what do you see we need to push for in a Swedish context in terms of public policy and demands on our politicians?
I think a really important point here is that building housing and homes for all is building welfare. And that has been sort of a tradition in the Nordic countries way back. But since the 90s, we've seen a deregulation of the housing policies and markets, which has created a situation which is a lot more difficult for many people to get into the ordinary housing market. So I think acknowledging the need for viewing housing as a human right also comes with a discussion before about the child rights being implemented in Swedish legislation from the 1st of January 2020, and we haven't really seen any effects of that. We actually see the opposite. We see people with migrant background with children actually not getting into the housing market at all. They are defined as structurally homeless, and by being structurally homeless, it's the housing market's fault or the availability of housing. And if you cannot find housing, then you don't deserve or not in need of social services help. So you're excluded of the help that you could actually have, which means that they are also you put the responsibility on the parents, so a responsibilization of the homelessness situation. That's a major problem. So I think we really need to acknowledge that this is not only a local phenomenon where you can have local politicians doing something. This is something that the government and integrated with other regional and local authorities have to really take a big strong position to housing for all.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And looking more on the global perspective then, and you, Fredrik, working with a UN perspective, what do you see are the main political challenges and what demands are put on the table from the people and colleagues you have met?
Well, if you see the film, it's very much also the story about political theories where we in the 80s got sold that the market will solve everything and then everybody will be happy, we surely knows that the market is not solving everything. I mean, also when in the transition of South Africa, there was also made some kind of deal where the markets should also save South Africa. The problem is that the market they don't really care about human rights. The market don't care about people's needs. And I think when our homes are placed on the market, then it's totally wrong. And so home should be for people, not for profit. And I think using the Constitution of South Africa or using the Constitution of Sweden to argue for that I think it's a very good thing, because good constitutions are tools for activists. But I think we need to find ways to fight corruption, because that the corrupt money is also destroying or getting invested into. I mean, thieves are also some kind of capitalists, so they also want to invest where they can have the best money coming out. So the corrupt money goes into homes or to housing. The same goes for the tax avoidance people. I mean, who are filtering everything through tax havens, which is also destroying democracies. And then in the end, you also have to find a way to limit the power of the vulture funds that go in and play around in our societies, and that money are so distant from people's needs, and when they buy homes, their customers are not the tenants in the homes. Their customers are the investors, and that's you could say that all that setup goes totally against the whole idea of a home as a human right, object of investment. So I think that's the politicians, the governments, the national governments and the local governments have to find a way to limit that kind of power. And you can do that through regulations, through legislation. Then quite often the national legislation is better, but I mean, you can also, as a city, you can use, of course, you can use the land that the city owns. That's something you can decide on. But of course, you could also try to stop permits. So you could actually start to negotiate with people who are about to build on land. So we won't give you a building permit if you don't also build homes for people who need it. So I mean, the politicians need to step up, basically.
In South Africa, this issue has been a burning political issue for a long time, and homes are still very much seen as commodities. What main challenges do you see, and what political demands are you putting on your government?
Yes, I think for us, since we subscribe to the democratic principles, we think it's fair, therefore, to be able to organize the masses on the ground, because that's when we can judge whether or not housing is a demand, and it is a human right, and it is a priority. It's people that has to speak from the ground. So if we were afforded the right to organize freely, because that talks to our democratic principles, are we able to organize and be able to win the hearts and the minds of the people on the ground? That would be the first demand. And I'm saying this because many organizations around the world are actually repressed. They are even unable to organize because the states will suppress the art of organizing. But the second demand would also to build and defend democracy, because housing is highly contested. If we're unable to build and defend our democracy, then we are highly likely to lose the battle we are talking about. But the third thing is what you rightfully put it, and I think Frederick has also alluded, on the decommodification of land and housing. So our demand is that land and decent housing would have to be decommodified. In other words, it has to be treated as a common goods for everyone. It has to be a right for everyone, to have, whether you have money or not. By virtue of a human being, you should actually be entitled, to this most important form of dignity we've talked about. And of course, the question of greed, putting the profit before human needs is problematic. Hence, the key demands from the African traditions, or rather Abahlali, is really that the state has to put the social value of land before its commercial value. So put the social value of land before its commercial value. In other words, profit should not be as more important as saving human lives.
Thank you very much. I want to look a bit on the reality that we are facing now with the COVID-19 pandemic, and I want to ask you, Nomsa, working in the center of this burning topic, what impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic have you seen in your work, specifically for women working as a woman in this struggle? What vulnerability do you see for women and other groups in this struggle for decent housing, especially during this year of a global pandemic?
It was not so easy during the time of, especially 2020, during the time of pandemic. It was not so easy, especially to us as women, because it was said we should be in the houses during the time of lockdown in South Africa. It was said we should be within the houses. But what we have seen during that time, most people, they are not working. If you stay in the house with no food, what are you going to eat, you and your children? We have seen so many evictions that happen in South Africa during the time of lockdown. While it was said there will be no evictions during that time, but most people, they were left homelessness. Most people, they didn't have those houses, but it was said everybody should be in the house. It affected a lot of women. As I'm speaking, I'll speak about the experience that we have experienced in Abahlali baseMjondolo. In one of our settlements in Azania, 29 brave women, they had to sleep outside when their homes, they were demolished. And they were arrested out of that. Their sin was just to sleep on an open space because their homes, their place that they call homes, they were demolished. In the sensitive time when they were supposed to be within their houses, it affected us a lot. And even with the basic services, because we are denied basic services in most of our settlement as Abahlali baseMjondolo. We don't have the basic services. So it was hard because we were supposed to wash our hands regularly, but we didn't have that water to wash our hands, because in most of our shacks, we don't have the basic services. It was very hard to us as Abahlali baseMjondolo women, and it was exposing. If you can see those women who slept outside, it was exposing them into danger of getting this pandemic, into danger of being raped, into danger of being killed. It affected us a lot, the pandemic. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nomsa. That's a very alarming picture you're painting for us. I want to go back to the Swedish perspective, asking you, Marcus, have you seen any impacts for this group during 2020? And yeah, what impacts do you see from the year of a global pandemic?
I think for the first, you can say that the pandemic really has elucidated, shown the inequalities in society. So staying home, as we heard here, is only possible if you have a home to go to. And also the whole idea about shared air problematics. So if you are many people in a small space, the risk of being affected is really high. Banning eviction has happened in many countries as one of the interventions to protect from COVID-19, but not in Sweden. It just continued as it was. But I think if you look at other countries like Australia, England, America, and other places, they have really, especially in Australia, they have framed homelessness during the pandemic as a public health issue. And by doing that, suddenly homeless people are moved into housing. And things that we thought we have been fighting for a long time that weren't possible suddenly is possible. So I think the pandemic has shown both inequalities, but also that we can do things if we decide to do them. So it's not a problem to solve homelessness, it's just the political will to do it.
Thank you. On that hopeful note, speaking about the importance of social movements and social mobilizing on the ground to now push this development in the right direction, I want to ask you, Sibo, being in the center of this, driving the mobilization, how are you organizing that, and how has that been for you, being an activist in South Africa, trying to push for this change?
The price for land and decent housing has been paid in blood. I know not only in South Africa, but millions of people around the world who have stood to speak against the forces that place us in homelessness and landlessness have had to be confronted. And unfortunately, they have been using violence. So social movement draws its power from its members, from its membership, from its constituencies, from its communities. And that's the only power poor people would have to organize and work out plans together. So, but we have had to pay a very high price for organizing. And that's, for me, is a serious problem, because it does somehow speaks to the question of whether or not are we in real democracy. Is our democracy working for us? Is our democracy saving the interest of the majority, or is our democracy save the interest of the elites who wants to put profit ahead of the human needs? So the power lies with grassroots formations that are democratic. Hence, we encourage organizing that social movement, grassroots formations, and democratic civil society formations have to stand up and say what is right for people, and let us be able to participate in decisions that affect our lives and our future. So for us, not only organizing domestically or nationally, but also internationally, internationalism and solidarity becomes very important if our democracy was really to work for all of us. So it is therefore imperative that social movements like Abahlali and many more would have to build strong foundation on the ground, because we have to speak the language of the people on the ground. It's important that we get the right language and we capture the right demand that resonate with the masses. And I just want to add that for those who work within the civil society or NGOs world, it is important that the intellectual work that they do would have to be grounded with popular masses. They would have to be supported by popular organizing on the ground for those great ideas to succeed. So I want to challenge and call upon democratic and progressive forces that it is high time that we work together, not in our isolated, dark, confined corners or in our silos. It is high time that we work together at national, but also at global level, and do more of the solidarity work, what I normally call as living solidarity, the solidarity that speaks to ordinary men and women in the township, in shack settlements, or in the working class neighborhoods, so that our power to democratize our communities, our countries, and our world is real and does benefit those who are in need of housing, for instance, as a human right.
Thank you very much, Sibu. I want to then ask you, Fredrik. Sibu is speaking about how solidarity is lived and the importance of organizing on the ground and the masses. When you were traveling around and meeting all these people, do you have any examples of creative ways of mobilizing or creative ways of pushing for a solidaric movement around housing?
I think overall, understanding that we have a global enemy and there is a global pattern gives us an incentive into looking into how other people take the struggle. And I can see that happening a lot, that activists around the world, they also talk to each other and get inspired by each other. Leilani Farah has started up an initiative called The Shift. You can check it out, maketheshift.org. Where they're also, so they are basically coordinating this kind of struggles around the world, and also giving you some maybe also legal guidelines and so coming up. So I think that's very cool to find a way to see what other people do. And I think it is, I mean, when I showed this film, I've been showing it in many places around the world, but I was like in San Francisco, and a young woman came up to me after the screening and said, "Fredrik, I feel less lonely now when I've seen the film." Because suddenly, if you understand that it's not your mistake, it's not your fault that you have a problem with your home, it's actually part of the system or of a structure that is not functioning. I think if we get out of this kind of, oh, I'm not good enough, to see the society is not delivering, we need to fight back and push back. And so if we see the patterns, it's also easier to unite with people from different countries, from different parts of your city. So it's, and I think that's it's a very good starting point to see that and to get inspired by activists. But I mean, you should look around. There is a lot of people taking the struggle around the world. And you should follow our podcast, because we are also talking to cool activists around the world. So please do that. Pushback Talks. You can find it on all these podcast platforms.
Thank you very much, Fredrik. That's a really good initiative, and what a great response on your movie. I want to ask you, Marcus, on this topic. I also know that you have done a lot of research around like the importance of the social work in connection to homelessness. And in Sweden, I mean, we have a long tradition working through churches and other solidarity initiatives. What do you see in your researches, and how important is it to actually practice the social mobilizing around homelessness and housing?
I think it's extremely important. I just want to connect back to Fredrik quickly, that the Shift is a great initiative, and I think looking at municipalities signing the Shift is also a possibility of highlighting if they actually walk the walk and not just talk the talk, because some sign the Shift on one level, and on the other level the definitions of homelessness exclude a large group. So the paradox in the Swedish context is that people actually sleeping on the street are not defined as homeless, but people living in an apartment are defined as homeless. So that's sort of the absurdity about organizational or administrative categories. So I think that's an important thing to fight against, what you can call political hypocrisy. And when it comes to social movements, I think we've had especially one mainly based in the youth movement is called I Want Housing Now. But when it comes to the more people experiencing homelessness, the movement is not that big in Sweden, unfortunately. What we saw in the financial crisis 2007-8, especially in Spain, suddenly they started an anti-eviction movement in Spain. And you would think, why hasn't that been done before? But one reason is that the middle classes was affected. Middle class people lost their homes, and suddenly using social media, getting organized, people were preventing evictions, helping each other out. So I think one major challenge for the Nordic countries is that most people experiencing homelessness are low-income families, and as long as middle-class families are not affected, it's difficult to get a movement going on. I think we need to rethink, because now we have a perfect opportunity not going back to how it was. Now we have a possibility of thinking about our utopia. And in that perspective, I think reframing the discourse from homelessness to homefulness, building cities of homefulness would be a lot better for our societies than sticking about or finding specific interventions for people without a home. We should instead build sustainable and also resilient communities. And that's not built on us and them, that's built on us.
So I want to ask you all, like, going forward in this time to push back and to reform the narrative around homelessness and really acknowledge housing as a global human right. What can we do to push this global solidarity movement building around the world? And yeah, how can we as individuals organize? And yeah, what actions do you see? I want to ask you, Nomsa, how are you planning your work going forward, and what do you see in the near future for you and for Abahlali?
I think what we should do as marginalized people, I think we should conscientize and build the people's power from below. I think we should mobilize ourselves and organize, because there's a power in organizing and there's a power in mobilizing. We should do this international solidarity. If we do that, I think we can, this system of capitalism, we can condemn it if we build the people's power from below, because the system is the one that is oppressing people, the system of capitalism, because those capitalists, they only care about their interest. They only care about the profits. They don't care about people's lives. So if we build the international solidarity, we can beat this system of capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nomsa. And I want to ask you, Sibu, what do you want to say to young people and to people around the world who want to engage in this issue and be part of the change going forward?
I would say unity is the power. Courage provides hope, and this would enable us not to fear to say what is wrong in our society. So I would like to invite especially young people to actually participate, find yourself a close by organization that you can do solidarity work, that you can do volunteering work, Even if it's okay on your side, it is not okay until it is okay to everybody. That's the kind of culture that I want us to install to our young generation, to say, if I am free, it doesn't mean that everyone is free. So as long as there is a person next to you who is struggling with homelessness or any other social ills, it should be the responsibility of us all as a society to stand firm and to say, but this is wrong, or this is right, and therefore it needs to be supported. So solidarity between and within struggling communities is very important if we were to win any struggle that is up against the norms and the majority of people in our society. We need to consolidate the struggle of the working class against capitalist thinking that actually puts profit before every human needs. So it is therefore important that young people especially, they must want to take part in doing good for their society, especially that they are still young, they have energy, they have passion, they have future. They need to act now to build the future that they want, so that we do not depend on your dad, on your mom. Then makes it your opportunity, because we all have a responsibility and a role to play in building our societies. So communities are built. You are not just by virtue of having a neighbor, you call that a community. Communities are built. We ought to do away with building gated communities, communities that do not speak to each other, communities that do not assist one another. Communities have to know your neighbor, know your constituency, and therefore have this conversation so that we can find a collective solution that will take us forward. So internationalism is key, solidarity is key, unity is power, courage is hope.
Thank you very much, Sibo. I also want to give that question to you, Marcus, from a Swedish perspective. How do you see, what recommendations do you have to people who want to organize themselves within this issue and be part of that collective solution Sibo is talking about?
I think it's great, and I think there's a big responsibility here for the social work field on global solidarity, and there are many international organizations working towards this, and I think that's one key, but especially have the grassroots movements going on, and also looking into the strength that we're talking about here, not a top-down or us for them, but also we for us perspective. So we really encourage people to help each other in order to create their own local organizations or connect with existing national, international organizations. But because I think sometimes a problem for us is when we become too nation specific, that we run the risk of learning from other societies, especially in Nordic countries. Sometimes we tend to miss the great opportunity of actually learning good stuff from countries in Africa and other places that have actually social work would be more on actually doing help on the basic human needs at this point, while in a Swedish context, maybe we forget about the basic human needs and start talking about some special techniques or special methods in helping people. And then we sort of ignore the basic human relationship between a social worker and a person that needs some help. And that's about trusting relationships, not professional, expert, and client. And that's very important. I think, unfortunately, we lack strong movements in Sweden, especially. We can see some bigger movements in Denmark around homelessness, for instance. And I think that's really important, being a voice and creating spaces that enables people to move on.
Thank you very much, and that is something we will bring with us, that we need more organizing in Sweden and to be a bigger part of those movements that are there and to make them bigger. Fredrik, I want to lastly ask you what you see and if you have any recommendations for our members and of course people around the world to be part of this struggle, and what do you see going forward? What's needed to be part of this pushback?
The pushback starts at home. The pushback starts with solidarity. The pushback also starts by understanding the structures. But you could also, so I mean, in my film Push, we talk about the global structure, but you could also, in your own hometown, map who are the owners, what has happened the last years. There is a lot of things happening, but we don't really see it from the outside because it's the same building standing there. But so I think it's very much about identifying the forces that are entering and that are making profits of our homes. And the next step is to shame them, to let them out. Use your social media, shame them, blame them, you know, keep the fire to their feet in some ways. And of course, talk to people, share your stories, and learn from inspirational people in places like South Africa. I would again say that this organization in Cape Town and Ifuna Ukwasi are really amazing. They are working with lawyers, you know, using the amazing constitution of South Africa, and they actually used the constitution against the city of Cape Town, and so far they have also won. So you can also use legal powers. I mean, use your constitution. So I think there's many inspirational ways to go about this, but start also local. Look around, because you will suddenly find out that the people who owns your neighbor's house or your own house is an investment fund that has a seat somewhere totally else, and that fund would also have an investment in South Africa or in Nigeria or in Southeast Asia. I mean, the money is so globalized, so we also need to go there. We also need to be a part of that global fight together with our comrades around the world.
I think we can all agree that housing is a global structural issue and that there really is power in organizing together. Afrikagrupperna want to thank you all for participating today, listening in to our prominent guests, and of course to our Per Anger Prize winner for 2021. If you have any questions to Afrikagrupperna or about this conversation, you are welcome to visit our Facebook page or contact us through our web page. There you also find information on how you keep engaging in this issue in different ways and how you can donate to our work in Southern Africa. We thank you so much again for participating, and we wish you a good day. Thank you.